Welcome to Big Blend Radio, where we celebrate variety and how it adds spice to quality of life. Welcome, everyone, as part of our Military Appreciation Month programming and Memorial Day and Memorial Weekend shows. We have Jeremy D. Baker joining us. He's the author of The Guilty Sleep, and it is out now. So you can go to his website, jeremydbaker.com, and the website is linked in the episode notes. And I'm very excited because Jeremy has done a lot. He's a former U.S. Army counterintelligence agent, a combat veteran. Woof, don't mess with Jeremy, actually. This is what we're going to get to. You also worked alongside U.S. Special Forces in Afghanistan. There's just so much in national security and going on counterterrorism and things like human trafficking, cybersecurity. Are we safe on Zoom right now, Jeremy? Yeah, how are
We're
you?
as safe as we could be. Yeah, it's great to speak with you today.
Yeah, it's great to have you on the show. You've got such a, diverse career, even though it's all about security at the end of the day, right? And seeing what goes on in the world of things that we all tend to want to close our eyes about. What led you to writing a novel going through all that? Did you need a release and say, okay, that's enough of that stuff?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it kind of puts us into some deep waters, sort of right here at the beginning. So let's dive right into that.
Okay,
Yeah,
splash.
exactly. So as you said, I've had a kind of an interesting career. I've spent most of my career working at sort of the intersection of intelligence work, law enforcement, national security, counterintelligence, counterterrorism, things like that. From 2000 to 2005, I was, as you noted, an Army counterintelligence agent deployed to Afghanistan. And I'm always very careful about how I talk about this. And you hit it exactly right. I was not in the special forces. I was attached to the special forces in Afghanistan for a good chunk of 2002, shortly after the original fall of the Taliban, and spent most of my time there in Southeast Afghanistan working with special forces, chasing Taliban and Al Qaeda all
Wow.
around the southeast of the country there. And it was a really interesting experience. And things also got pretty hairy a few times. And so when I got back from that deployment, I found that I was struggling with PTSD. And what I found was the best way to sort of deal with that was writing. I had always loved stories and loved telling stories, never seriously considered writing any, but I was just having yet another sleepless night. And I was reading a collection of short stories. And I thought to myself, I'll try to write something like that. So I started writing short stories. And I found that the act of writing allowed me to take sort of the things that I was thinking and feeling about my time in Afghanistan, the things that I was struggling with, my emotions and unexplained rage and bad sleep and some of these other things that are all sort of hallmark PTSD issues. And I was able to take that and kind of maybe give some of that to other characters in the stories that I was writing. And that allowed me to kind of step back and look at those thoughts and feelings. And it became a kind of therapy for me. And so I've been writing ever since, mostly short stories, but I started getting a little more serious about the writing, 5 or 6 years ago. And then this specific novel I was inspired to write, I actually started writing it in October of 2021, just a couple months after the U.S. pullout from Afghanistan. And like many other veterans, I'm sure, of the war in Afghanistan, as the U.S. was pulling out and the Taliban was swiftly taking the country back over, I found myself feeling a lot of feelings and thinking a lot of thoughts and talking to a lot of fellow vets about their thoughts and feelings. Was looking for a way to kind of capture that a little bit, but also tell a really interesting story. And the other sort of main inspiration for this book actually is from my family. So the protagonist in the book has a wife and a young daughter. I have a wife and a young daughter. They're both extremely important to me. And so I wanted to write a story that takes place sort of during the fall of Afghanistan and look at all of the thoughts and feelings of the people who serve there, to talk about objectively PTSD and its impact on those who fight our wars, acknowledge and recognize and pay tribute to the significance of my family in my life, while also telling what I hope is a really interesting and fun and propulsive heist thriller type story.
I'm really glad to hear about, taking on the issues of PTSD because it's still kind of quiet. I mean, it's a lot more vocalized now than it was in the past, right? I think even 15, 20 years ago, it was pretty quiet. And PTSD does have a way of sneaking up on you. I've been through it because I've been through some, emergency situations in my life where I didn't realize. We were in wildfires and went through a series of wildfires where we evacuated 7 times in a year and a half in a mountain town. And none of us slept because we were always awake looking out for another fire. And we had an arsonist that was trying to burn our little town down. So I didn't realize I was starting to lose it, man. And I had a friend turn around and go, Lisa, the fires are over. You can go to sleep now. And then I think a week later, the really big one hit. I'm moving, So PTSD, I mean, that's little compared to what you experience, but so many people who have been in war and those kinds of situations is just very quiet about it. So I think it's wonderful that you are raising a voice and also doing it in a storytelling way. A lot of times people journal, but crafting it into a story, unless you're taking a journal and making it a memoir, it seems to give it a bigger life and in a way more positive. Do you feel that when you were writing it, that it took maybe a negative and made it into something more positive?
That's a great question. I mean, I think so. I think, for me, writing, especially when I first started writing, was an act of kind of self-therapy. And you're right, like PTSD was not, sort of, I mean, it was known about and it was understood, but it was not being treated super proactively, I would say, in the early 2000s. And for me, it was the only thing that helped was the act of writing. So I think, especially now over 20 years on, and I was about 20 years on from my deployment when I started writing, I was able to write about it much more objectively and factually as my main character struggled with his own post-combat PTSD,
Mm.
where I had the gift of time and distance from those early days, but I could still recall very clearly, the aspects I could recall very clearly the aspects of PTSD that I went through at the time and was able to talk about those clearly with my protagonist.
Well, talking about writing and the story, like it's great that it's a heist because it gives it this other energy, right? So you've got parallel lines running through the book. Do you want to give everyone an overview of The Guilty Sleep? And The Guilty Sleep, that is such a good title, isn't it? It really
Thank you.
is. That's
No, I
perfect.
appreciate that. I'm a big fan of novels that use the title somewhere in the book. The title "The Guilty Sleep" comes from a conversation that our protagonist has with his military team leader and mentor, and they talk about an interrogation technique when you have a guy, in custody, and he's adamant that he didn't do it, and you're pretty sure you think he did it. Is you hold him overnight, and the guys who are innocent will be tossing and turning and pacing the floors, worried that they're not going to be able to convince you of the fact that they're innocent, and they're going to be consumed with the possible repercussions of their actions and what happens if they're not believed. Whereas the people who are guilty will usually sleep like a baby because they know that they're caught, even if it's in their subconscious, and they know they'll either get away with it or they won't, but they know that they did it. So that's kind of where the title comes from, is from that conversation and that interrogation technique, which is a very real thing. But to your first point, sort of what is the plot of the book, or what is the book about? It's a great question. The book is about an Afghanistan vet. His name is Dexter Grant. He's an Army counterintelligence agent who served in Afghanistan sort of in the late 20s. So his deployment was a few years ago, and he's now back in the world. He's in the National Guard. So he had a day job when he was in the military, where he works at a bank, right, as his civilian job. And while he was serving in Afghanistan, something really bad happened to him and to his team. And so he struggles with PTSD from that. And now back in the civilian world, he continues to struggle with PTSD. He is estranged, unfortunately, from his wife and his very young daughter. He is borderline alcoholic. He is trying all kinds of ways to self-medicate and deal with the problems that he's having. And he wants so badly to do the right thing and to get his family back. And he just can't seem to find a way to do it. And on top of all of that, he has been booted from the National Guard, and the health insurance isn't good, and his young daughter needs surgery to correct an issue with one of her eyes, and so he's got all these financial strains on him as well.
Mm.
And lo and behold, his former team leader approaches him out of the blue, his team leader from his Army days, a guy that he really respects, who was a mentor to him, who was a senior counterintelligence agent, comes to him and says, "Hey, look, I need your help with something. Our interpreter that we had in Afghanistan, who saved our lives when we were there, is trying desperately to get to the US, but he can't because of bureaucratic snafus. And so me and a couple other guys from our old team are trying to get some money together to help him get to the United States, right, and save his life. Will you help us?" And our protagonist, Dexter, says, "Well, I'd like to help, but I can't. Look at my situation. I have no money. I'm in bad with my family, and I'm barely holding it together. I can't possibly help." And then, his old team leader says, "Well, hey, look, you work at a bank, right? And we know from what you told us about your job in Afghanistan that it's quite possible that, there are some criminal elements who might be involved with your bank and your boss at the bank. And so maybe you could help us rip off some of these criminals to get enough money to save our interpreter and get him to the States. And that is kind of where the book shifts into overdrive as Dexter thinks about getting involved in this heist. And as things often do with criminal plans,
Mm.
things don't go according to plan. And his wife and his daughter end up threatened and in danger. And there's some twists and turns along the way and a lot of action. And so you've got these two threads, like you said. The main one is sort of in modern times, going through Dexter's being recruited to take part in this heist and what happens, along with that. And then throughout the book, there's a thread of flashbacks to his time in Afghanistan, and specifically, this terrible thing that happened to him and his team when he was there, and the mystery of how that happened, and trying to figure that out as well. And those things kind of weave together in and out around the thread of PTSD, but also family. And again, I talk about the inspiration, of my wife and daughter as kind of, really stabilizing positive influences in my life, excuse me. And so it became really, really, they talk about, when you write, you should put yourself into the story. And there's so much of me in this, from my time in the military and what I did in the military, my experiences in Afghanistan, my struggles with PTSD, but also my experience with my wife and my daughter. And in fact, as I mentioned, Dexter's daughter needs surgery on one of her eyes to fix a vision problem. My daughter had that exact same medical condition when she was Dexter's daughter's age. So there's just a ton of me in this book, I think, is the quick way to answer that question.
So it's kind of a memoir, but not the heist part, right? But, you worked in, organized crime, transnational organized crime on the security side, right? Not doing it. And from that level, I mean, even human trafficking, I think, isn't it true that once a trafficker, you will traffic anything from wildlife to humans to ammunition, drugs? It doesn't really matter, does it? They'll traffic anything at that point.
That in many instances, that is correct. Now, you'll have some organizations that specialize in narcotics trafficking, and do that as a core business line. But if, for example, you look at some of the Mexican cartels who are known mostly for smuggling drugs, what they will do is they will sometimes directly engage in smuggling people across the border
Mm-hmm.
into the US. Or at the very least, if there are organizations that specialize in moving people, they will have to pay a tribute or a plaza fee to the cartel that controls that geographic area in order to move people. And so the smuggling of people is actually a key part of this book, because what our protagonist Dexter is brought into the group to do is to help fund the movement of their interpreter, their former Afghan interpreter, and his family from Afghanistan through Asia and Africa, and then across the Atlantic on a cargo ship to the United States. And that is essentially a human smuggling venture. And as you'll see from the book, as you said, criminal organizations, if they are trafficking people or goods, they will often, smuggle or traffic the other. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we've done a lot of shows on trafficking and even the human trafficking that just happens within our country. I mean, just
Mhm.
in normal neighborhoods. And it's all part of drugs being used too, and just even within schools, it's creepy, And again, I love that, you're bringing all these things to light, and even organized crime. I think sometimes in life, we as just regular people forget that criminals, that is their career. Just as like we want to move up in different corporations and we take our careers seriously, so do the criminals.
That's
And when
right.
they watch to do something, this is I mean, they're good at it. I always look at, when you look at, the cartels, and when you have somebody at the top, and some of the women are like, don't mess with women, man, because I tell you what, they're organized. And you think back to even Machine Gun Kelly, for example, Catherine Kelly, his wife, was the organizer of everything. She was the
Mm-hmm.
mastermind, and she made her husband do things, and he's the one who went to jail for the longest, I think he died in
That's
jail
right.
now.
No, you're exactly right, and that is actually a perfect sort of tie-in to the guilty sleep here. Is that the criminal enterprise that becomes the target for this heist is led by a woman. It's led by Angelita, or Angie Cook, who is basically someone living the American dream in a way. She's an immigrant from Guatemala in Central America, which is there's a significant international diaspora in and around Maryland, where the book is set and where I live, of folks who have come here pursuing the American dream from places like Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, but also East Africa, right? There's a rich Eritrean
Mhm.
population, Somali population, and it makes this wonderful melting pot. And I'll note here that, of course, incidences of crime from people who immigrate to the United States are significantly lower than those committed by native born US citizens. But in this case, Angelita came to the US and married an American who was himself kind of a low rent, two bit criminal who started a construction company and did some, drug running on the side. Well, he dies before our book starts, and Angelita, who is incredibly smart, a great businesswoman, very calculating, shrewd, organized, as you said, Lisa. She
Yeah, I mean
takes
that happened with Colombia with some of the cocaine things going on in
exactly.
Miami. I can't remember her name, but I mean she got I've done so many mafia stuff over the years, you know.
Sure.
Yeah, we had a guy that was on a show that worked with Whitey Bulger, and that was
Wow.
crazy. And so he was kind of in the mafia, but he wasn't. He was in the Boston Hill Gang, but he wasn't
Hmm.
quite 100% because he wasn't Italian or anything, but he was like in it. And then he was like, he was on our podcast. We were doing this, it was years ago. And so I said, well, what do you do now? He goes, I'm in delivery,
What
which
does that mean, I wonder?
I know I gotta get, but and he friended me on LinkedIn, and I'm like, this is classic. It's hysterical, but I don't think he's there anymore because I couldn't even remember his name. I was trying to find it like a few years ago, but it's. I mean, I remember that woman. And she was just she got people running up the ranks, and some of the biggest drug lords that we have going like from Colombia, the Cayman Islands, all of that. She put them up through the ranks, and you didn't mess
Hmm.
with her ever. You'll die. Like,
That's exactly right.
these are not, we romanticize these things so much, but they're killers. They are.
Yeah, it's a business built on blood and suffering, and human misery, and that is very much, there are aspects of this book that touch on that, and that touch on and show, I think, very clearly the nature of the world when you're talking about these types of criminal enterprises, and the one that Angelita Cook runs, that Dexter and his friends are targeting, is very much a drug smuggling enterprise, right? Methamphetamine, fentanyl, and other opioids, things like that. They sideline in moving guns around, which is, of course, another, sort of epidemic of death, So very, very bad folks. And you don't want to cross them. And yet our
Mm-mm.
protagonist, poor Dexter, is drawn into crossing this very dangerous woman and her organization.
When you look at all of that, and then, you've got these army guys together. So there's that camaraderie too, right? And then things
Mhm.
get wonky, and that can get wonky. I don't want everyone, I have to be careful, no giving the book away, right? No spoilers here allowed. But where is the line come where, there's, things like Border Patrol and stuff like that. Then there's, FBI, there's, police, there's all of that. But does the military ever get involved in any of these kinds of cases on the security level? Like, where do they get to
Sure.
step in on things?
So the US military traditionally does not operate on US soil. There have been exceptions in the past, and we're seeing now, right, more Department of Defense involvement in things like securing the southern border. But very typically, and traditionally, the DoD mission on US soil is actually limited to National Guard soldiers who are a part of counter drug task forces. There's specific legislation, the U.S. code, that allows the Department of Defense National Guard units, and I think some Army Reserve units, are able to do counter drug missions, but just not on their own. Like, you're not going to deploy a military unit just for counter drugs. You're going to assign soldiers to counter drug task forces, and a lot of times that looks like intelligence support. You'll take a National Guard, military intelligence analyst or something like that, and put them on a task force. You see this a lot actually in Puerto Rico, where the Puerto Rico National Guard has
Mm-hmm.
folks in DHS and law enforcement task forces working the counter drug mission. Critically important, intelligence work and language support and things like that.
This is interesting. And I think we, as, the civilians, don't quite get it all the time with what's going on. We have our own
Mhm.
labels. You know what I mean? Like, I didn't even think
Sure.
about that with the military here. because I was raised outside of this country in East Africa and in South Africa, and lived in Mexico for a while too, and that was interesting. Military presence is everywhere.
Hmm.
Any just uniform presence is all over. And kind of different than here. I remember when we lived in Kenya, I was a little girl, and my mom, she would, if a policeman pulled her over and told her to give them a ride to the store or something, she'd have to do it.
Hmm.
Kind of different than here, and everything is bribery. Even when we were in Mexico, we were looking at starting our magazine between the two countries, which was incredibly naive. Even though just because we lived in Africa, we were very different coming here. We're very different. Let's put it that way. We still have a different kind of thick skin. I don't know how to explain it. You understand that more, I think, being in Afghanistan and what you've done, that we've been through a lot of riots and
Hmm.
bombs and learning, what an AK-40 is and all that
Yeah.
kind of stuff. You're trained. And when I got here to this country, I felt very insecure actually here. Because even in
Wow.
Europe, everything you do, you go through a bomb check, a
Hmm.
weapons check. And when we got here, there was none of that. And this was pre-September 11th. And I remember just going, if there was a package in a mall, you ran out of the mall and called security and ran like hell. Not here. People pick up the package. And I'm one of those people who will like, don't pick up the package, it'll blow up. You were trained not to.
Hmm.
So it's very interesting. I never even thought about it, that the military isn't. Yeah. Wow. So in going with that, because you're educating me, and I know a lot of our audience too, and then those who've served in the military know all this stuff. But with the guilty sleep, it seems to me that having the heist and the family side of it in there, that this is for all people to read. So not just those who have served in the military. So you're able to reach a bigger audience that may learn more through this story. Wouldn't you say, with the guilty sleep?
Yeah, that was my intent. And so I hope people do find that to be the case. I wrote it with as much sort of true to life verisimilitude as I could when it came to the military aspects, while still trying to make sure that it makes sense to the reader. And I think we did hit that sweet spot. Like, you don't have to be a veteran or in the military or to have a family member who's a veteran to know what's happening in the scenes that are sort of focused on his time in the military. I think those scenes will resonate and feel accurate to, hopefully, to the veteran community and the service member community. But my principal focus was, how does the story make you feel? And
Mm.
you don't have to know every acronym to know that what's happening in the story at that moment makes you feel a certain way. And then, to your larger point, yes, there's a lot of this story that in my mind kind of boils down to this recurring theme of a guy. He's not Superman. He's not a genius. He's not bulletproof. He's a guy who's got some training and he's got some experience, and that has left him wounded, but he has some capabilities, but really he's just a guy. He's a husband, he's a father, and he wants to, this recurring theme of, he's trying to figure out what is the next right thing. And he's struggling because of the PTSD. He's struggling to see it. He knows he wants to get his family back. He knows he wants to help save the life of his interpreter. And he's faced with the choice of doing basically criminal stuff, right, to try to get this former interpreter of his taken care of, to try to find that next right thing that will let him feel okay about himself. And if maybe he can feel okay about himself, he can figure out how to get his family back and figure out how to be okay. And that at its core is really what the novel's about.
Very cool. So everyone, again, The Guilty Sleep is out now. You can go to jeremydbaker.com. The link is in the episode notes. In closing, Jeremy, do you want to see this as a movie? Because it sounds pretty epic to me.
Would love to see this as a movie or a television series. Without giving any spoilers, I am working on the sequel to The Guilty Sleep,
Do
which
it.
so I think
I
that
was
would make a great season
placing a bet
two.
on myself.
Excellent. So one or more characters from The Guilty Sleep will be back, and yeah, I do feel like this would be a great movie or TV show. Anything's possible. Would love to see that happen someday.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for listening to Big Blend Radio. Keep up with our shows at bigblendradio.com.